Greetings to you all. MP here, and I am doing my first Midnight Philosopher Reacts video. In this inaugural episode, I will be responding to a video by Catholic commentator Brian Holdsworth entitled, "I Would Never Marry a Non-Catholic." In Brian's own words, he is a struggling Catholic thinker, apologist, writer, speaker, and communication professional. Before we begin, let me offer 2 bits of important context. Cards on the table. I'm married to a beautiful, benevolent woman who happens to be non-religious. She means the world to me, and so the topic of Brian's video is quite personal. Another thing worth mentioning is that among Catholic, and especially traditional-leaning commentators, I'm quite fond of Brian. For more than a decade now, I have grappled with doubts about the faith, and in more recent years, especially after the election of Trump in 2016, it has become more difficult to remain Catholic. But when I take time and space to consider or re-examine various elements of my childhood faith, Brian Holdsworth continues to prove that he is someone who strives to be kind, well-spoken, and a man of good faith. So though I may strongly criticize parts of this video, I in no way wish to imply a diminished respect for Brian himself. So let's get started, shall we?
Okay, let me just start off by saying that this is not a video about Catholic supremacy. It isn't about why Catholics are better or more desirable than anyone else. It's about why you should marry someone with the same fundamental beliefs as you, and the serious liabilities you invite if you don't. Now,
right off the bat, let me start with a point of agreement here with Brian. Spending a lifetime with someone is a gargantuan undertaking, and sharing values is indeed crucial.
obviously, as a Catholic, I think it's the true religion. That's why I'm Catholic. And we should be able to say that without having to pretend otherwise for fear of offending other people. If you're a Protestant or a Jew or a Muslim or otherwise, it should be because you think that's the true religion or faith or belief system. As a Catholic, I believe there is much that is true in those systems of belief, in those faith traditions, but where they depart company with Catholicism, I think that the Catholic understanding is the correct one. And marriage is one of those things that puts those beliefs to the test because it raises the stakes. If you're living life well, it will be amplified in marriage. If you're living it poorly, same thing. The stakes are huge in marriage, so it's worth planning for and being deliberate about. A successful and happy marriage is a very blessed thing, as I can personally attest to. A failed marriage is personally, psychologically, financially, socially, and spiritually devastating, and not just for you, but for your children and your extended family or your future children as well, which I can also attest to as someone who lived through it as a kid.
Here I have to praise Brian. He represents a respect for marriage and a spirit of discernment that I think is very much lacking in the broader culture. I think society would do well to take some of Brian's advice. I too am suspicious of the way that marriage and sex are handled in the present day and age. Often these matters are treated far too casually and even with irreverence. Now after this, Brian goes on to talk about how infatuation is an insufficient reason to commit to a lifelong union, and he also discusses the challenges that come with people changing. And when the married couple have differences in religious practice and in values, the change could be in opposite directions, leading to a break in union. Again, I think Brian raises valid concerns, and I wouldn't argue with him there. In order to keep things moving, I'm not going to labor over every single point he makes, and I will of course link his video in the description. But let's skip to the 4:36 mark.
As a vision for who they want to be and how to get there. And if their roadmap for getting there is sound, then they will find success in that, at least some success. Ideally, you and your spouse want to be changing in the deliberate kind of way, and in a way that you both agree to, because you're both going to have to be married to the person that your spouse turns into. And your moral values are that roadmap. But if your spouse is like agnostic, atheist, or just another religion, then you aren't using the same roadmap. If they're relying on the secular ethics of today or just another religion, then the person they turn into is going to be a more amplified version of those values. Because the more you practice a certain way of life, the more it becomes you. Simultaneously, if you're going to practice something like Catholicism, then you'll be moving in the opposite direction of your spouse as they continue moving in theirs. And that's just a recipe for disaster. Either the relationship will suffer as you become strangers to each other, or your moral integrity will suffer as you find yourself compromising your moral integrity so that the relationship doesn't fall apart. And let's be honest, that's not the kind of dilemma someone who loves you should force upon you, but it's exactly what happens when you marry someone with incompatible beliefs to you.
While Brian presents a valid concern here, the buried premise is that Catholic morality is largely incompatible with other value systems. And while that can indeed be true, I think the situation here is far more complicated. And in our present day multicultural world that continues to shrink thanks to communications technology and the internet, I think we can appreciate that human moral intuitions globally and across time have more in common than we might think. The key differences between Catholic morality and other value systems are in bedroom matters and the particularities of unfalsifiable dogmatic theological abstractions. More on that later. Brian also raises the very important aspect of marriage, and that is parenthood. When the spouses have different moral values and different religious practice, that can indeed cause tension and conflict when it comes to making decisions about how to raise kids. Now, I'll return to some of these matters later on in the video, but I will skip ahead to the 8-minute and 30-second mark.
If you believe in salvation or the afterlife, you may find yourself admitting that your spouse's soul is heading in a different direction from you. This person that you've built your whole life with and somehow managed to survive the perils of everything I just described, only to watch them head towards a spiritual cliff in the last years of your life. Dying and letting go of this life and everything that you've built in this life is going to be hard enough. But as a Catholic, I have hope that it isn't just a tragedy at the end, that God has a plan for us if we accept his rescue plan. We get to experience the fulfillment of everything that we hope for. But your spouse, if they reject that rescue plan, is walking a road to despair. And you'll have to watch them walk it alone or be tempted to walk it with them and lose your own soul in the process.
And here it is. Ultimately, even in Brian's compassionate tone and softer language, Catholic marriage boils down to the real threat of hell and what is ultimately a transactional or even coercive view of spirituality. Do this or else. Believe this or else. Speaking also from my own experience, I very sadly cannot find religion quite as hopeful as Brian does. But I'm happy to concede that that may be a me problem, a midnight philosopher problem.
Lastly, if you're a Catholic, you know marriage is a sacrament, and in order to be a valid sacrament, you have to marry someone who is at least baptized. But even with that, there's going to be complications about it being licit. So let's say even you overcome all of that and it's licit and valid. There's still going to be a massive issue, which is openness to life. Because if your spouse is not open to life or intends to use contraception illicitly, then this would strongly jeopardize the validity of the marriage. So let's say you're a Catholic who wants to benefit from the graces of the sacrament, but your betrothed has no intention to honor the consent of the vows of a Catholic wedding. Well, then the sacrament doesn't take place. Furthermore, if they are using contraception or expect you to, then you will be participating in the deliberate frustration of the ends of marriage, which is a grave sin and one you could be trapped in for the duration of your marriage. And this is a big one because how many non-Catholics are going to be willing to entertain the kind of openness to life that the church expects of us? Most baptized Catholics aren't even willing to do that. And that frustration of conjugal relations is also going to frustrate the intimacy that you and your spouse can enjoy, because the intimacy of that bond is an effect of rightly ordered human sexuality. But disordered human sexuality, which is one that is divorced from its teleology, is one that is going to produce disorder in the relationship. And if nothing else,
and of course, inextricably tied to the fear of hell is the high control of a couple's intimate life. Well, I believe Brian represents the ideal. That is, openness to life, ensuring that the procreative and unitive elements of the conjugal act remain intact. Life is messy. For one thing, finances can be very tough. An important piece of context is that Brian lives in Canada, and he would benefit from the monthly child stipend. If I remember correctly, the government offers $500 or $600 monthly for each child from birth until they hit double digits in age. That really alleviates a lot of the financial burdens, especially for middle and working class families as they raise children. In places like America, we don't really get that benefit. And as wages continue to stagnate and the present administration could be doing some serious damage to the economy, it's very difficult to ignore the real struggle families may have when bringing new life into this world. And there are many other personal factors for delaying or avoiding children. Maybe some of us are only children caring for aging parents. Perhaps some of us still have dreams and goals that are unfulfilled, or personal growth that we have to attend to before we feel prepared to welcome children. And I haven't even mentioned the plethora of health issues that women may face with pregnancy and childbirth. And yet, despite all of these variables, intimacy remains a valid need for married couples. The most personal of marriage decisions should be made without threats of hell, with no shame or fear. If you're interested in hearing my commentary on the complexity of human sexuality, here's a link to the first long-form video I published on this channel called Perspectives on Sex.
Else, that should be a deal breaker for anyone who intends to live as a faithful Catholic. And if you're Protestant or Christian of another affiliation, I know that prohibitions against contraception seem weird because it's so contrary to just how everybody lives their lives today. But in the scope of Christian history, you're absolutely in the minority if you think contraception is okay. Christian churches were 100% unanimous in their proscriptions against contraception for their entire history, all the way up until the cult of sexuality of the 20th century, which has been disastrous in its effects, if you know anything about that history. And then one by one, all the churches changed their teachings, not because they found some new insight in the Bible, but because the secular world pressured them into embracing its promiscuity, which has led to disease, the breakdown of marriage, and the sterilization of our civilization such that we aren't even able to replace ourselves anymore.
Anti-contraception has become something of an identity politic for the church. Instead of considering the possibility that other denominations and even secular society have valid objections or points of concern, they have doubled down. NFP, or natural family planning, is something of a half measure or a compromise. But when disagreements are often dismissed as grave evils or intrinsically disordered, a real conversation is virtually impossible. Heretics, quote unquote, will always be anathematized. The harms of contraception, while real, are also overinflated, while the harms of traditional rigidity in marriage are downplayed. Catholic marriages can have imperfect results, and extremely strict adherence to the letter of the law can result in very serious harm, especially to women. It's not right to blame those who fail to adhere to every single rule. For more on NFP and the burdens that Catholic sexual teaching lays on married couples, check out the Uncharted Catholic Man podcast for very important conversations that we need. It is also essential in these matters to consider the perspective of women. In the description, I will link to articles on patheos.com and Chris Damien's Substack that shed light on women's suffering in Catholic marriages. Again, to clarify, I'm not saying that Catholic marriages are bad and that the rules are bad. Those guidelines are there in place after much thought and much deliberation. But we also have to consider that most of these rules, in fact, perhaps all of these rules, have been authored by celibate men in ivory towers so far removed from the lived realities of married couples.
So if you find yourself in this situation, you're in love and your significant other is not of the same religion as you, you should have a serious conversation about these things and explain to them that you intend to practice your faith all the way to the end. And you should talk about all of these big moral questions like sexual morality, raising children in the faith, and the very strong need for them to convert in order for this whole thing to work out. And don't make this mistake. Don't go into marriage using it as a means to evangelize somebody. Don't marry them expecting that they will convert over time, because of your love. It's a huge risk that, all things considered, isn't worth it, because it's probably not going to work. And they're just as likely to evangelize you in the opposite direction. How do you know they aren't going into this thing thinking the exact same thing? Because that's kind of a stereotype. It's really typical. Lots of people go into marriage intending to change their spouse into a better version of what they want. And they're not going to be upfront about that, obviously, because then it wouldn't work. At the end of the day, marriage is a huge commitment, and without a commitment to actually align your lives in the most important ways, it's destined for friction, if not failure.
Now, please allow me to get a bit more personal here. My wife and I have talked, and if and when we are in a position to welcome the blessing of children, she's agreed to allow me to raise them Catholic. When we have taken vacations abroad, without even asking her to, she finds churches for me to attend Sunday Mass. On special occasions, she'll even come with me to services. Practically speaking, our temperaments, our values, and our communication are well aligned. The only difference is the cosmic narrative and theological language which we were or weren't raised with. And herein lies my gripe with organized religion, and in this case, with traditional Catholicism. The prioritization of abstractions and unfalsifiable beliefs that can seem so divorced from lived experience. I don't love my wife, honor my mother and my father, or give to the poor when I am able, because God is a Trinity. Jesus was born of a virgin, died for our sins, and rose again. I, my wife, and those with or without religion do those things because in the course of our lives we have learned that they are good in themselves. The narrative in which that morality is grounded varies greatly in its utility. Another point Brian raises is the despair and risk of losing one's soul. After a few years of taking a more relaxed approach to faith compared to my rather traditional upbringing, I've had to confront the anguish of this teaching. And for me, the high-stakes salvation framework of Catholicism has weakened my desire for children. I don't want them to carry this fear with them. It has also prevented me from sharing Catholicism as openly with my wife, as well as some non-religious friends, because I find myself having to whitewash the more horrifying aspects of theology. In the case of my wife, the potential for her conversion had already been compromised before I met her. She had a couple of unfortunate encounters with zealous Protestants. When she was about in her mid-teens to early 20s, on more than one occasion, she was told to accept Jesus or lose her soul. So, despite her respect for me, and the space she gives me for the spiritual life, her first impression of Christianity was a message of coercion and of fear, rather than the gospel, the good news of love and justice. I had hoped that Catholicism might have something better to offer than the Protestant that my wife had met. But as I have intermittently gone down the traditional rabbit hole and listened to the likes of Father Chad Ripperger, who allegedly represents a more authentic version of Catholicism, the type of Catholicism that was most prevalent up until the Second Vatican Council, I've had to confront a certain grimness about my own faith. Brian Holdsworth raises valid concerns and offers incredibly important advice for discerning marriage and the necessity of spouses to align their values. Where I diverge is in the full acceptance of a rigid and ultimately threatening salvation framework that does not ensure goodness of heart nor a happy marriage. I fully realize that my views flirt with heresy, and on most days, perhaps I'm not even able to call myself a Catholic in good standing. But in following my conscience, I, for the life of me, cannot choose abstractions and institutions over people, and especially not over the love of my life.